My very first endeavour into programming was actually writing my own game without any experience. So you would think that having that type of self-drive and motivation and focus and will to complete something would actually count for something when you're looking for a job. No. Recruiters and employers don't give a about your achievements or what you've achieved. If I was hiring someone, I would actually appreciate someone that had some sort of entrepreneurship or small business type of skills or focus and drive to actually finish what they set out to achieve. You know, learning a computer language and getting an idea and actually finishing it and following through, I think is quite a bit of an achievement. Mind you, I was only young at this stage and it hasn't gotten me anywhere. So what did I write? I wrote a game for the Commodore 64. This is when they first came out in the mid-1980s. So it was a text adventure game, something similar to Zork. So if you're anyone who actually played a computer around the mid-80s or even the early 90s, you would definitely know Zork. So the game I made was fairly similar to that type of thing. All written in BASIC, so I had to learn BASIC. And writing for the Commodore 64 did come with quite its challenges. For one, it only came with 64 kilobytes of memory, not megabytes or gigabytes, kilobytes. So after the operating system took up its space, you only had about 39K to write your basic program in. There were no developer tools, there were no libraries, no documentation, almost no documentation. So for actually finding out how to program things was quite the chore. So to save my work, well, the Commodore 64 had a 1 megahertz 6500 processor. So by today's standards, it's as slow as a wet week. I mean, 1,000 times slower than the computers they make now. And with the small amount of memory it had. And because there were no tools or libraries to do things, if doing anything tricky like graphics or sound or anything like that was a matter of accessing memory and putting value into memory registers via these peek and poke commands. So if you wanted to generate a sound, say you had to poke a certain memory location and then poke it with a certain value, and that would produce a sound. So you can imagine how agonizing it would be to just create even the most simplest type of music. So the game being a text adventure game, the only thing I did special was I developed it with my own custom fonts, because fonts on the Commodore 64 from memory are sprites, so you can bitmap them to anything you like. I had a custom cursor. I did have some raster graphics in it, which is like line drawing graphics, line and fill type things, you know, very simple. Back then, this is before the Commodore Amiga, so it didn't have a proper graphics type of engine. So the Commodore 64 had a resolution of 320 by 200 and it was 40 columns and 25 lines. When you booted up the Commodore 64, it booted up into a basic interpreter and there was no editors, so you actually just typed your code on the screen and gave it a line number and it would sort of interpret that as being a line of code. And actually writing the program, because it was basic, it had to be written in a procedural way, so there's no object oriented at all. There wasn't even any functions back then or procedures, so the whole thing was one gigantic block of code. So initially I wrote it all as a bunch of go-tos, and I quickly found out about halfway through that it was just getting too unmaintainable. So I sort of had a bit of a think about it, and I sort of started writing everything in like a state engine type of thing. So when some interaction went on with an object, it would put that into a certain state, and then other parts of the program will look at that state and then work out how to display the text. So pretty much just state-driven mapped tables. Back then, the other thing I didn't like was a lot of adventure games is you had to type the exact phrase, otherwise the computer had no idea what you're talking about, which was actually very frustrating. So I worked out a way of doing lookup tables, so it would look at keywords, a bit like programs work now. So say in the game, if you saw a mailbox and there's a letter in there, you could, as long as you had the word open and letter, you could say open the tiny letter or open the letter or whatever you want to say. And because the keywords open and letter were in there, it would actually do that action. So I was quite pleased with that result. So it took me a few months to write it. And back then we didn't have hard drives, so everything initially was on a cassette tape. And it was as slow as a wet week. Just to load a 30K program would take 10 minutes at least. It was extremely, extremely slow. And I had to have multiple backups all the time just in case the tape failed or I got some dirt on the tape and the whole program was unusable. After quite some time of dealing with that, I ended up buying a floppy drive which had a massive 170K capacity. That's kilobytes, not megabytes or gigabytes. Thousands of times less storage than the modern hard drives, or probably 1,000,000 times less storage than modern drives. But back then it was enough. Yeah, so I finished the program, I actually wrote an ending. So these adventure games, I worked out, is more probably a work of interactive fiction more than actually a proper action game. So you actually write a story and then you choose actions people can make, so there can be different outcomes, or they can, it's a bit like write your own adventure story if you remember those books when you were a kid. So something like that. So and the program actually filled the entire memory of the machine. So I used all 38 or 39K of memory. So once that was all done, I tried to find a game publisher. I found one, and they actually offered me a job doing some part-time accounts, so which was good, but it wasn't something I was interested in. But it's good because I could actually keep an eye on the progress of the game and see what happened. So the way it went was some cover art had to be designed for the game. They had to go to the printers. They had to design and print some of the actual casings for the game itself, and then came the marketing. So back then there was no internet, so you couldn't just stick stuff on Amazon and expect to sell millions of copies. So the first stage was actually distributing it to all the local game stores. So all the large supermarket chains and the local stores, and they all had to be within driving distance. So that's how I first started. So I'll just show you what the game looks like. So there's the game. Here's the back. This one is a cassette tape. So these are masters I managed to keep for all these decades, and they must have made it good back then because the plastic's still good. So here's the other one. This is the disc version. And there's a floppy disk inside. Using the cassette cover as the cover. So I was working there for a couple of months, and this all got done, and they printed off I think maybe about 400 copies of this, which they distributed to all the stores. My commission was not very high. It was okay, I guess. I think the game sold for about $20 back then. That's probably expensive by today's standards, but back then software was expensive and also hardware was expensive. That Commodore disk drive, I remember paying $600 for that. back in the 1980s with only 170k capacity. But an average wage back then, it was super expensive. So I went back and forwards with the printer a couple of times to get it right, and they had someone actually help do the wording for the back of the cover here. So not much effort went into it, but a bit of effort. I just supplied the code, and they just had some machines to mass duplicate everything onto the floppies. They had a machine where you just stuck all the floppies in and then it would just replicate itself. So a few months after that, guess what happened? The company went bankrupt. I lost my job there. They didn't even pay me for the last few weeks of work, and they kept writing me checks which bounced. And I actually received absolutely nothing from the game. So last I heard, they sold about 400 copies and I didn't get 1 cent from it all. So the only thing I've got left of that is the game. I don't even have the code anymore, so if I needed to get it, I would have to get it off the disk itself. So I thought I'd just share this little story that how you get screwed multiple ways. You know, you create something and you get used. I guess the money from selling this game got to pay their creditors. Fast forward to the future, it hasn't helped my career one bit either. I actually did mention in my resume, and I don't think I had a single person comment on it or even get to the part of reading it, so I just took it off. It was sort of kind of a waste of time. So hope that was useful. So if I was writing a game, I would definitely publish it myself. So more recently, I did write some other software for a mobile. This is for the Windows phone before they stopped making those. So it was encryption software. So it was software to keep your photos and your messages private, so it encrypt and decrypt. So I used it as an exercise so I could understand how terms, how all of that stuff, hashing, how all that worked. I do advocate for that though. Thanks for watching, and till next time.